Fantastic. So welcome everybody. I'm so happy to have you all here today. My name is Emily Ann Opala. I am the Knowledge and Research Lead here at the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. And I'm so happy to have you all here to talk a little bit about Indigenous needs on Ontario campuses. Before we get started, I'd just like to start us off today with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to state that I'm coming to you all today from Treaty 13 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It's also sort of represented by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share this land. So when I do these land acknowledgements, something that really comes to mind for me is a quote by Octavia Butler. And she says, belief initiates action or it does nothing. And so I hope that in the spirit of reconciliation, that we can all come together today and talk about action and talk about how we can use that belief, use our belief to move action forward and consider some of the ways that we can actually support Indigenous peoples across Ontario. So with that said, thank you all so much. I'd like to just go through a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. So I'd just like to bring your attention to the bottoms of your screens. You'll notice that closed captioning is enabled. You can close or open closed captioning to your preference using the buttons at the bottom of your screen. At the bottom of your screen, there's also a chat function for discussing your thoughts and reactions to today's presentation. You'll also notice a Q&A function. So the Q&A function is more for submitting questions to our panelists, to Megan today. And we'll be doing all of our questions at the end of the session today. I'll also remind you that there will be a survey at the end of today's webinar that will pop up on your screens, and I'll ask you to please take just a couple of minutes to fill in that survey. It's really helpful for us in future webinars. And finally, I'd just like to say that this recording will be available on our website post-webinar, so I would check tomorrow to see the recording. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce you all to Megan VanEvery. Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Emily Ann. Thank you for the warm introduction. I will share my screen. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Megan VanEvery. I am Seneca Nation Turtle Clan from Six Nations. I am the Indigenous Post-Secondary Research Lead here for CICMH, and I'm really excited to share our findings from our Indigenous Mental Health Needs Assessment today. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge our partners. So the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health is a partnership of 5 organizations, including Colleges Ontario, the Council of Ontario Universities, the College Student Alliance, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, and the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division. Our mission is to engage and support Ontario colleges and universities in their commitment to supporting student mental health and well-being. I would like to take this time to thank our partners and acknowledge their support and assistance with the development and distribution of our needs assessment. This morning, I will begin by providing some context within Indigenous mental health and post-secondary students, and by outlining our project objective and talk about our process and methodology. Then I will outline a summary of our sample breakdown. From there, I will provide an overview of our summarized results and common themes from our needs assessment, and finally concluding with next steps. To provide a bit of context around our project, we should highlight some key information surrounding Indigenous mental health and Indigenous post-secondary students in Canada within the province. As you can see, about 1.7% of Indigenous students attend an Ontario post-secondary institution. with only 57.7% of Indigenous people holding a college or university credential and 32.9% having a bachelor's degree or higher in Canada. Previous research on Indigenous students in post-secondary has shown they experience feelings of isolation from moving out of their home community to attend a college or university, and this is amongst, especially in northern areas. Another one is cultural exclusion, as transitioning into a westernized institution where often Indigenous customs, perspectives, and ways of knowing are excluded in the classroom, environment, and institutional policies. Indigenous students find difficulty in paying tuition and trying to learn how to be financially independent from family. Lastly, experiences of racism from peers, faculty, and within the institution itself. Some of the experiences of mental health faced within Indigenous communities may stem from the intergenerational impacts and trauma from residential schools and colonial practices throughout history. Due to experiences of racism, westernized policies or practices many do not seek support. Consequently, if they are not provided with the culturally appropriate support and services that are not safe, this may lead to them using alternative coping mechanisms such as substance use and even self-harming behaviors, and in some cases, suicide. Having a general understanding of the lived experiences of Indigenous students in post-secondary and general mental health experiences amongst Indigenous communities provides context in providing appropriate and safe mental health support services for Indigenous students. Our primary objective of our needs assessment was to identify gaps that exist in supporting Indigenous post-secondary student mental health and well-being across Ontario. Through this needs assessment, our goal was to better understand how best to improve mental health services for Indigenous students from a student and staff perspective. Our project implemented a mixed methodology design using both a qualitative and quantitative approach of open-ended and drop-down survey questions. Indigenous students and staff were asked to complete the needs assessment through an online survey platform, which we used SurveyMonkey. We had two streams of questions, a set directed for Indigenous students and a set for Indigenous staff. However, we want to mention we did not have a French component of the needs assessment due to limited resources and language barrier. We went through research ethics and received approval from the Community Research Ethics Office. There were obstacles during the approval process, such as delays in the review from committee members, ensuring confidentiality and security of responses, and incentive for participants. Throughout the development of our needs assessment, we worked closely and consulted with various stakeholders, and I would like to mention a special thank you to Dr. Deb Kyoto, who provided insightful feedback and guidance. CICMH works closely with post-secondary institutions across the province through our Indigenous post-secondary community of practice, which out of that developed an Indigenous advisory board, which consisted of Indigenous representatives from various Ontario colleges and universities, such as College Boreal, Trent University, University of Guelph, and Laurentian University, to oversee the work of the needs assessment, such as survey question development and distribution. I would also like to say a big thank you and Nyawa for their support and guidance in the delivery of our needs assessment, much appreciated. The COP and the Indigenous Advisory Board are made up of the Indigenous stakeholders in the post-secondary system. In addition, near the beginning stages of our project, we presented our needs assessment with the project design and preliminary questions at the Council of Ontario University's reference group on Aboriginal education, and another presentation at Colleges Ontario IPAC meeting for feedback and to promote our work. So now I'll be moving on to our study sample. In total, we had 147 Indigenous students and 51 Indigenous staff within the province of Ontario participate in our needs assessment. Of the 51 Indigenous staff, we found slightly half self-identified as frontline facing staff, such as counselor or psychotherapist. Our survey was available from mid-November to the first week of January. However, I would like to highlight when the survey was first created and available, we were hit with a bot attack within 24 hours it was open. We quickly shut it down and revised a new security protocol when participants accessed the survey. I would also want to mention we had a gift card incentive for those who participated. However, we only had limited number of responses wanting gift cards. This shows the importance of the needs assessment as participants voice their perspectives rather than wanting a gift card. As outlined here, you can see we had a majority of respondents either attending or working at an Ontario university, followed by college and Indigenous Institute. Similarly, majority of our respondents attended or worked in the northern region, followed by central, west, east, and south. The disparity in regional numbers from respondents may be associated with the time of year we had the survey open for, as fall semester was winding down and exam time around the corner. Also, maybe the consequences of the bot attack, as we had to eliminate previous data and redistribute our survey to our stakeholders. And other factors such as institutional policies around ethics and email fatigue targeting students. I apologize for the dogs. The next few slides, I will be providing an overview of summarized data and highlighting the challenges and needs faced by Indigenous students. When we asked Indigenous students if they accessed mental health services on campus, we found 69% of Indigenous students did not access services on campus. Indigenous students shared the reasoning as to why they did not seek services was because they were unaware of services, they did not know where to go for support, they did not feel they need to access services, they used third-party counseling off campus, they had difficulty accessing services or had a negative experience, or they did not feel comfortable seeking support. And as in one response highlighted here in the quote, "My classes are hybrid, I use a counselor outside of school." When we asked an open-ended question to Indigenous students if they experienced any stigma when accessing mental health services on campus, surprisingly, we found 50% of those students who responded did not experience stigma. However, I would like to mention other common responses we found was Indigenous students did not access services, the feeling of being judged and being fearful of repercussions of accessing services on campus, Indigenous stereotyping, and shy, intimidating, or seeking support. With experiences of racism and cultural exclusion, this is interesting to find as we expected to have a high number. We asked a general question about their mental health and found 47% of Indigenous students stated their mental health impacted their ability to continue their studies. As we can see here, Indigenous students are impacted by mental health, and it is vital we ensure they receive the care that they need. We provided a list of potential barriers and asked Indigenous students to check off as many that they feel would impact one's ability to access mental health services on campus. So we have here inability to access health services in a timely way, which means class conflict or appointment of hours, do not know where to go for help on campus, feeling ashamed about accessing support, feeling the services may not meet their needs or assist in any guidance that they need, do not know where to go for help in the community, COVID-19 related barriers, such as appointments being online only, services not being culturally safe, appropriate, or relevant, and services being inaccessible, meaning geographical in that response, or in a language such as English and maybe not in French. So here we found that the majority of Indigenous students feel the inability to access help or services in a timely way, which was the most popular, followed by many Indigenous students did not know where to go for help on campus. We also asked this question to Indigenous staff and found similar results. If Indigenous students are not receiving the support due to service availability and unfamiliar where to go for help on campus, this may consequently impact their academic performance and personal well-being. From the barriers identified previously, we asked both Indigenous students and staff what improvements can be made. And here I've highlighted only the student responses. However, I do want to mention we did find similar responses from Indigenous staff. A common theme found amongst both Indigenous staff and students was the need for improved accessibility of service on campus. For example, more availability and flexibility of service hours to accommodate student life and course schedules. Students also shared the creation of an online booking system for services as well. Students expressed the need for services to have both in-person and virtual option to accommodate distant and remote students and to enhance anonymity among students as well. Similarly, Indigenous students and staff shared concern of improving the awareness of services, such as improving the marketing of services on campus. There were numerous responses stating students didn't know where to go for services on campus. They didn't know where they were located, or they were not aware of services provided. And in some cases, some students gave up and did not bother seeking services. A third common theme was both Indigenous students and staff continuously addressed the need to access culturally appropriate supports and activities on campus. Indigenous students highly stressed the need for increased access to Indigenous staff, such as elders, like expanding working hours or hiring elders on a full-time basis. Having access to medicine people, healers, and more mental health counselors to talk to. There's a limited number of staff hired in these positions to meet the demand of students' mental health needs. Many expressed the need for more cultural-based supports, such as sharing circles and activities, such as ceremonies, smudging, social events, drumming, and returning to land-based activities. Many Indigenous students voiced the need for more specific mental health interventions on campus, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or trauma-informed support to meet their unique mental health needs. And lastly, Indigenous students also addressed the need for psychoeducation materials, such as webinars, guest speakers, and courses on general information about mental health and self-care options. Here, I provided some quotes from Indigenous students who provided suggestions of improvement of mental health services on campus around marketing and advertisement of services. So the first one states, I think there should be more advertisement of what services are offered. Also, maybe the creation of talking circles or group mental health activities so people don't feel alone. And the second respondent is promotion, awareness, encouragement to use, and how to use availability. Visual and frequent reminders of all the above, especially during high stress times, midterms, end of term, finals, holidays, when students may not have the capacity to search out for help or even realize it's available. Here I have another quote from an Indigenous student expressing a need of cultural supports made available on campus. They state, flexible spaces that prioritize Indigenous well-being and ways of connecting, relating, support Indigenous ways of healing, smudging, sacred fires, medicine gardens, etc. Adaptable policies that consider Indigenous ways, example, circle consensus versus a hierarchy. When we asked Indigenous students what their preferred formats of resources they would like to see created, majority addressed that they would like to see online courses, followed by toolkits and info sheets. These responses highlight not only the need, but also Indigenous students voicing the best format they would like to be received. So now I'll be switching things over and providing an overview summary from our Indigenous staff portion of the survey. So when we asked Indigenous staff if they experienced mental health related issues in the workplace, we found 64% stated they experienced compassion fatigue or empathetic strain exhaustion. And so as a brief definition, compassion fatigue may be developed when carrying a client's emotional pain resulting from the desire to help relieve the suffering of others. Empathetic strain is caused by exposure to occupational stress at higher than normal intensity due to factors such as increased workload and understaffing. For those Indigenous staff that answered yes, we asked what resources or supports they used to manage their mental health. Common responses were they would talk with others, such as friends, family, and colleagues. They use external supports, such as community resources, counseling, and use their work health plans. Third is self-care. So they would take time off work or engage in exercise or just going outside. And lastly, using traditional or cultural supports, such as going to ceremony, talking with elders, and using traditional medicines. We found 29% of Indigenous staff take on mental health support duties they were not sufficiently trained for. Common responses by Indigenous staff described providing support to students in crisis, providing counseling to students in general, and providing support or allyship to staff and coworkers. When we asked Indigenous staff about the caseload regarding Indigenous students, 75% stated they've seen an increase in Indigenous students, and 82% seen an increase of complexity issues faced by Indigenous students. These findings align with comments made with members from our Indigenous community of practice. Many share these concerns addressed here, and it is vital we give voice to their experiences. I have shared another powerful quote from an Indigenous staff member highlighting a very common challenge faced on campus. They say, we have one Indigenous personal counselor for 500 self-identified students. It is a difficult task for one person to take on, but even getting this position was a challenge. We need more Indigenous counselors or more culturally trained counselors to assist our student population. We asked a similar question directed at Indigenous staff and provided them with a list of potential barriers to providing support to Indigenous students. As we can see here, majority responded with the limited number of faculty trained in Indigenous mental health, followed by the limited number of frontline staff trained in cultural safety, and thirdly, the limited number of staff trained in crisis management. As we can see, the limited number of staff and specifically qualified trained staff available on campus, Indigenous students are impacted by this and consequently not able to meet with available counselors and not receive the support that they need and deserve. I've shared a few more quotes here from Indigenous staff expressing concerns surrounding limited qualified Indigenous staff on campus and discussion around the improvement of awareness of campus services and communication practices. So the first Indigenous staff states, we need more trained Indigenous staff to meet the high demand. At our university, we have added a second cultural counselor position posted for over a year and have not been able to find a suitable candidate. And the second quote, they state, less siloing of supports, divisions or department names doesn't matter. Students need to know what services are available and where to find them. That's it for Indigenous students. Campus services need to be connected to or at least know about the Indigenous-specific supports on their campus. For example, student centers, elders, Indigenous-specific counseling, so they can make appropriate referrals. When we asked Indigenous staff what they would like to see improved for a psychologically safe campus, they expressed concerns and need for increased training for all staff. Responses stated mandatory training for all staff, such as cultural safety, including in an Indigenous mental health perspective, trauma-informed and intergenerational trauma, crisis management, understanding the Indigenous student experience and lived realities in order to provide appropriate support and understanding, the lived experiences of mental health faced within Indigenous communities. A second theme found was to provide specific training for non-Indigenous staff and faculty, such as understanding the history amongst Indigenous people, such as the impacts of residential school, the Indian Act, have an understanding of Indigenous ways of knowing the importance of the truth and reconciliation calls to action, and anti-oppression within the institution. A third common theme was the need for more opportunity for professional development days, focusing on microaggression in the workplace, self-care and work-life balance strategies, and understanding lateral and cultural violence within the workplace. And finally, a fourth theme, the need to implement an Indigenous ways of knowing perspective, such as having access to ceremony on campus and Indigenous supports, Indigenous-specific supports, such as access to medicine people, elders, and healers. Again, I have provided another set of quotes here from Indigenous staff highlighting suggestions on improving the workplace. So the one shares, people to understand microaggressions, understanding how to hear what is needed and ask how they can help. Implement formal policies for Indigenous ways of doing things for students and valuing these ways of doing things. And the second, supporting staff capacity and well-being so we can continue to give our students the high level of support and expertise they need. Infusing Indigenous knowledge into everything we do and how we conduct ourselves to create a culturally safe space for Indigenous students. Policies that support Indigenous students in being away from classes due to ceremony. So upon review of our findings from the needs assessment, we found areas that require further exploration. We found a very limited mention about various Indigenous-specific programming aiding Indigenous student mental health on campus. We're not saying that they don't exist, we're just highlighting we need to talk more and share about the different types of Indigenous-specific programming available for students. As we only asked Indigenous students one general question about stigma, there is knowledge to be gained by asking more direct questions around stigma experienced by Indigenous students on campus. Similarly, when we asked Indigenous students what formats they would like to see created, we lacked information about what type of resources they would like to see. As our needs assessment was only available in English, we were not able to include the voices of French-speaking Indigenous students and staff. A recurring theme found amongst Indigenous students and staff was the need and the importance of holistic well-being incorporated in mental health supports made available on campus. As illustrated from a quote from an Indigenous student. They say, invite Indigenous elders and healers to work with Indigenous students. Needs are different and require a spiritual component to holistic health. As we wrap up our needs assessment, we will be developing a final report at the end of the month. Through our findings, we will create knowledge management products to support the development of frameworks, policies, and programs for Indigenous staff and students within post-secondary institutions. In addition to our survey, we are happy and excited to share we are working with Cambrian College to host a sharing circle in person next week. As previously addressed, we will continue this work and include a French component to the survey questions to be distributed. I leave you with a final comment from an Indigenous student expressing the possibility of future mental health supports for Indigenous students on campus. They say, consistently and continually implementing an Indigenous empowerment program that assists students with culture, self-esteem, anxiety, and depression, encouragement, etc. So thank you, Inyawa, for everyone in attendance and listening. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Megan. That was fantastic. I'm sure that that people got a lot out of it. Oh, we're getting lots of thank yous and great presentations in the chat, so that's fantastic. I think at this point, what we wanted to do is get a little bit of feedback from the audience. So we would love to hear from folks out there. What particularly stood out to you about these results? Is there anything that was surprising to you? Anything that particularly stood out? Or are there any particular Indigenous programs that you that work specific to Indigenous students that would be interesting to share here? Does anyone have anything that they would like to share? You can go ahead and put that in the chat if you'd like. So we already have one comment here. I was surprised with the desire for virtual preferences. Very interesting. Yeah, that was definitely surprising. Any comment on that, Megan?
Yeah, like as we've seen in the presentation, the findings that so in some cases it was a barrier for some to have remote, but then also it was also very surprising to see that they would also want virtual. But some of their explanations was that yes, some are remote learners. They are only online learning through campus, so an online component would be best to meet their needs.
Very interesting. We have one question in the chat here asking, was it particularly Northern students who wanted remote or virtual options? I don't know if we know the answer to that.
No, I don't know whether we have those specific numbers because of the security and protocol policies we put in place with the survey. So I'm not really able to associate like what students said what in what region they were in. So, but yeah.
Okay, so it's not a question necessarily we can answer. That makes sense. We have someone here who's shared in the chat, at UManitoba, we have an Indigenous Student Center and a spiritual care and multi-faith center that offers some of the services suggested, such as sharing circles and knowledge keepers. Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that, Brianna. We have, Lorraine here in the chat who's shared that they work in the Central/East region and offer both, and at least 40% of students request virtual or phone appointments. Very interesting to hear. Yeah, thank you for that addition, Lorraine. We have another question here from Brianna. When students discussed increasing promotion/awareness of services, were there any specific suggestions mentioned? I think this and all of the information was very helpful, and I would be interested to see in perhaps what ways may best reach students, i.e. social media, posters, face-to-face. Do you have any insights about that, Megan?
Yes, sorry. I probably should have addressed that. So yeah, there was an option to provide because that question in particular was a open-ended response. So students were commenting and sharing suggestions. So when it came to more advertisement and marketing, students shared through emails, shared around posters available on campus, and just more communication.
Interesting. We have a comment here from Carol asking, any comments about the flexibility of hours? Was evening appointment times a noticed thing? Did we ask about that in our survey?
I think it was when we asked about the barriers, with the list of barriers that they had to check off. In the first one, it was kind of included within the question. So like hours of operation / conflicting of schedules. I think that was kind of the main finding. So some students commented on that, yes, due to personal and or class schedules, many wanted services outside of hours that were offered. So in the evening and on weekends that they would like to see as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. We have Jean Patrick here who's commented, MHCC recently partnered with Inspire and gave an online workshop on stigma and the experiences of Indigenous youth / post-secondary students. I'm curious to see what more data comes out on stigma and Indigenous youth mental health in the coming years. We are as well, Jean Patrick. That is definitely a big question that we're also interested to see. We have a comment here from Brady saying, space for smudging is always a question when holding space with clients who wish to integrate smudging into their care planning. At CMHA, we have been working to address cultural disparities and also meet people where they're at by building bundles to support our FNMI clients and communities. Yeah, that's fantastic. We're really glad to see that. That's really great. Thank you for sharing that, Brady.
But yeah, students also shared that as well. In some cases, yeah, some students didn't even have a space to hold for smudging or even have a student center as well. So many addressed that need too.
Definitely an important one. Maria here has mentioned in previous meetings, we heard that the cost of gas and distance means remote / virtual support is helpful. Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you for that, Maria. Sharon here has said, certainly some very specific needs and desires related to the Indigenous student population presented that are very helpful and informative. So thank you. Wondering if the center has a comparable assessment from broader student population that touches on knowledge of available resources / contacts, access to services, delivery preferences, and caseload / ratios that may highlight specific needs, desires in these areas. Very good question, Sharon. So we do in fact have a needs assessment that we provide to the entire campus population across Ontario. And so we do have some comparable assessments, definitely, on the broader student population that touches on some of these aspects as well. And that's something that we might incorporate within the final report of this particular project. We have another question here from Jennifer. Were difficulties to accessing disability documentation for academic accommodations noted as a barrier?
If there was, it wasn't a really major concern and it wasn't really highlighted among students. If there was, maybe very few students addressed it. And so in my presentation, I only highlight the really main themes that were found and what students really addressed based on their number of respondents and comments made.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Lorraine has also shared here, the flexible hours poses challenges due to safety. However, if offered virtually, this would reduce that concern. That's definitely a great point, Lorraine. Thank you. Catherine has shared at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, we have an Institute of Indigenous Learning, formerly the First Nations Center, and they've posted a link to that. So thank you so much for sharing that, Catherine. That's very helpful. If folks would like to check that out, the link is in the chat. Jean Patrick has also responded to Sharon to say that CAFA has a report called A New Abnormal that surveyed broader student populations on similar topics. Absolutely, you can always check that out. Definitely, I believe we actually have that report on our website, so you can go look that up on our website. That's campusmentalhealth.ca. I'm going to invite folks to continue to submit their thoughts and things in the chat, and to continue to submit questions with the Q&A function. So please continue to do that. If you have any other thoughts, any other things that surprised you, it would be great to hear that. I'd also like to ask folks if there's any questions folks wished that we had asked. Any questions that folks are particularly that's burning in their brains that folks wish that we had asked in our survey. We'd love to hear that as well. We have another comment here from Lorraine saying we find significant barriers for students requiring disability/assessment documentation. Significant systemic barriers might be useful to explore in future endeavors. Definitely, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Lorraine. So we have another question here in the Q&A for you, Megan. Did you do a literature review? And if you did, was there anything that stood out to you?
I did previously begin a lit review prior to the needs assessment. Basically, what I outlined in the context of the presentation, that's kind of what I found in my lit review.
Was there anything that was surprising in your lit review? Anything that really stood out to you, Megan?
Just the number of students who really, I guess, like the limited number of supports that are available and just the experiences and challenges that they face, which is another reason why it is important that we did create this needs assessment to really highlight and really voice the opinions and needs of students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. We have a comment here from Elizabeth who shares, it would have been great to students to reflect on how helpful Indigenous-specific services and counseling are when they were able to access them. That's a really great question, Elizabeth. Yeah, that would have been really great to include. And I think in future endeavors, we might consider that as well. Carol has also shared here, any issue around self-ID mentioned and feeling like they cannot access Indigenous services? Did that come up at all?
Throughout my review of responses, again, as the other question was addressed, that wasn't really mentioned. If it was, it may be one or two students maybe addressed it, but again, I just really addressed the major findings and comments made by students.
Okay, so that wasn't necessarily a major issue that came up. And if it was, I imagine if there were issues of self-identification that folks were experiencing, that is a limitation, I imagine, of this survey as well, in that this survey required folks to self-identify, correct?
Oh, correct. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that is a limitation that we have here. We have some more questions here. I've heard previous data share that students struggle to access online modules on mental health because the format is too similar to their courses. Might there be a gap between how students believe they want more info on mental health versus how they actually are willing to engage in this information? This might be something to explore further. Yeah, definitely. Any thoughts on that, Megan?
Yes. Like as I mentioned in our findings as well, it'd be interesting to hear feedback from students to see from the resources we create or just based on previous resources that are created to see any feedback on what they would like to see or changed or how that can be improved. But yes.
All right, great. We have another question here from Emma in a follow-up to the literature review question. Were there any really good papers that you came across in your lit review? Anything in particular that, or documentation from Indigenous perspectives that stood out to you?
A few, yes. If you want, Emma, I don't know, Emily Ann, if I could provide my email in the chat, and I can definitely, she can reach out to me and I can definitely share that with her.
Definitely. We'll definitely add your, I will do that right now.
Okay. Yeah, and if anybody else has any specific questions or want to follow up on anything that I shared or questions, please feel free to email me that Emily Ann has provided in the chat.
Fantastic. Yes. So you can find Megan's email address in the chat. We have another comment here from Elizabeth. We hear from students that reluctance to self-identify is related to disconnect from culture or feeling not Indigenous enough culturally. Is that something that you have any comments on, Megan? Anything that you would want to share about that?
I did come across, not in the needs assessment, but in past literature talking about that, where they feel that students, if they do self-identify, they may have more barriers or more challenges or stereotyping, or maybe tokenized based on their status, or treated differently, or have stigma attached to them as well.
Yeah, definitely a big issue, a big topic. Fantastic. So folks, you're still welcome to continue to submit your questions in the Q&A function and through the chat. And I'll be continuing to look through those. But since I don't see any more, I have a couple of questions for you, Megan, that I'm hoping you can answer. So my first question to you is, what was the greatest challenge that you sort of went through in developing this survey?
It was definitely ethics. The ethics was a definitely big hurdle for us in the development, but also the distribution of our survey. There was a lot of hurdles and obstacles in place. As I mentioned in my presentation, there was delayment, a lot of back and forth between the community members about changes and adaptations within our delivery of our needs assessment with regards to security protocols, discussion around the incentive with regards to the gift card, how we distribute that amongst the participants, and definitely security was definitely a hurdle to make sure their identities are anonymous and also their responses. So we definitely had a lot of time around trying to make sure our project was ethically sound. So that was a definitely big challenge for us.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I know the Research Ethics Board process can be a tough one for sure. We have another question here, but I'm gonna go ahead and ask my question first. Megan, what was the greatest surprise to you in these results? Was there anything in these results that really shocked you that you weren't expecting to see?
I would say, let's see. I would say the number of students that access services on campus. I was expecting not a really, I was expecting a low number, to be honest, based on what I've read and based on responses from students. I thought the number was actually pretty higher than what I expected. So yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a surprise. Yeah. And was there anything other than expecting a low number for that? Was there anything else that you were expecting to see based on the literature that you had looked at before?
Yes, so based on student and staff responses, a lot of them did share similarities, and I didn't want to repeat myself for the staff component of the presentation. So I wasn't really surprised that, yes, the need and want of more cultural inclusion, such as support for like cultural specific supports for mental health counselors, and also access to ceremony and different things like that. And also the issue with accessibility. So for example, like the hours trying to conflict with their personal schedules and class schedules. But I never really thought that the location and identification of programming would be a concern. That I think, again, that was another surprising result that I found from students.
Yeah. We have a comment from Lorraine here in the chat saying it would be helpful to understand more about systemic and structural barriers in providing mental health support, isolation, siloing, clinical supervision, available infrastructure, etc. Do you have any comments on that, Megan?
I feel like it is definitely needed. We're still in this, even though we're trying in our efforts to really make steps and pave way and really addressing the calls to action, I definitely feel that there still needs to be more change to be involved.
Definitely. Another comment here from Emma, the wanting to have online booking options for mental health support is interesting. It makes sense as it is so commonplace elsewhere, but I feel like post-secondary is behind in this regard. Yeah, definitely. That's a really great point, Emma. Anything to add to that, Megan?
Yeah, it was really interesting to find that, yeah, a lot of students wanted the online booking system. I feel that many of the students commented on more about convenience. Again, just having being an online presence and maybe working remotely or being on campus remotely, or just having a more distant geographical component as well would definitely be helpful.
It's looking like folks are commenting that they got recently online booking systems for counseling, and it's been great. It looks like we have one at Lakehead and at Laurentian, so that's fantastic. Thanks, folks, for commenting. All of this sort of being said, that's sort of it for my questions. Is there anything that you, Megan, wanted to share, anything that you wanted to sort of highlight before we end our webinar today?
I just feel like I feel that this needs assessment that we created is definitely a stepping stone in the right direction. We really gave voice, well, we, in our very best efforts, tried to include the voices of Indigenous students and staff within the province. However, again, I just wanted to mention that because of our really tight timeline and restriction of this project, we weren't really able to have the duration and the number of respondents that we would like to have seen if we did have it for a much longer duration. But again, I just wanted to acknowledge and really appreciate the responses that we did receive. I feel that, again, hopefully from these needs and suggestions that students and staff provided, we can definitely address these and really voice their concerns.
Definitely. I was going to close up, but we have one more question here that's just come in from Sharon, and we have a little bit more time, so may as well do it. Sharon's asking, wondering if you can clarify or provide specific examples of student issues experienced related to access to ceremony. Perhaps could be helped with a broadening of policies related to religious observance.
Students express concern with regards to limited opportunities to ceremony. Some students expressed that maybe there wasn't a lot provided, or maybe it just conflicted with schedules. And then maybe even the actual space, because students expressed concern that they didn't have a space for ceremony. I feel like those were some of the major responses from students.
Great point. Yeah, thank you. All right. So not seeing any more questions. I'm going to give folks maybe one more minute just to come up with their last minute questions. But in the meantime, I'll just say thank you so much to Megan for joining us today, for that excellent presentation and for answering all of our questions about this really fantastic project. It was really great to have you on the webinar. And thank you to all of those who attended today and who came with their really interesting, insightful questions. This was really a fantastic opportunity. We have a lot of thank yous in the chat, so we're very appreciative of that. Thank you, everyone. I'd just like to say again to everyone, please take a couple of minutes to fill out the survey that will be distributed at the end of this webinar. And we will see you folks not in April, but in May. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar in May. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.